Hello dear students, researchers and teachers watching this module on barriers and stimulants to development or change, including goals and value dilemma. At the end of this module on UGC's e-Pathshala, the students will be acquainted with the barriers in development or change. They will understand the stimulants in the process of development or change and also become familiar with value dilemma in the process of development or change. In the process of change, the first and the foremost question that is often asked is, what makes an individual or group or any other social system decide that change is desirable? Is the decision to change or not to change ever clear to the client system? What are the various arguments that can change project or continuing one that has already begun? These are the various questions which interest change agents and goad them to examine the change forces and even the resistance forces in the change process. A change force has its origin in any aspect of the situation and it increases the willingness of the client system to make a proposed change. A resistance force has its origin in any aspect of the situation and reduces the willingness of the system to make a change. These forces may be rational or irrational, recognized or unrecognized, general or even specific. They may originate in the client system, in the environment or with the change agent. It may be a driving force pushing the system into change or a restraining force which blocks action. Change forces and resistance forces operate in tandem with each other in almost every situation. For example, in a group or community, some people will want a change, while still others will want to maintain the status quo. Many people will have conflicting desires. They would like to see the benefits change might bring and they are afraid to give up the security and satisfaction that they enjoy by following the old set ways of doing things. In case of a disturbed individual, the ambivalence may be extremely intense. He definitely wants relief from his painful symptoms, but he finds it almost impossible to give up the habits that generate these symptoms. Whether the conflict between change forces and resistance forces leads to individual ambivalence or arguments between individuals or formal conflict between subgroups, its resolution is an important part of the change process. A careful evaluation of change and resistance forces or extensive opposition to the change project is important so that the change agent knows whether or not to proceed further, give up the idea of introducing change or even postponing till conditions become favorable. Once change project is initiated, the objective of the change agent is strengthening the change forces, weakening the resistance forces or even both. Maintaining a favorable balance of forces is a continuous job for change agent and client system. Lippitt et al. Have elaborated forces and factors stimulating and resisting the process of change. These are: number 1, initial forces towards change. Second one is emergent forces towards change. Third is interdependence of subparts of the system as a source of change and resistance forces. Fourth is resistance forces and fifth is interference. Next, all these forces will be elaborated one by one. The first one is initial forces towards change. At the beginning of the change process, the change force may be general in character, comprising of unfavorable judgments of the existing situation and favorable judgments of existing and potential future situation. 4 types of motivation may be distinguished here. First, the client may feel dissatisfaction or pain associated with the present situation. Then the change force is a desire for relief. For example, a sick individual wants to be cured of his symptoms, or an unproductive group or organization wants to find way to do things more efficiently. Second, sometimes the dissatisfaction arises from perceived discrepancy between what is and what might be. For example, community members may not feel any real dissatisfaction with their local government, but when they see the improvements which have been introduced in other communities, they may begin to want some of the same things for themselves. Another example is officials of a school system may want to be democratic, yet may be unable to free themselves from autocratic practices. If this discrepancy were brought into focus together with suggestions about what to do, they might very well respond with a desire for change. Third is, sometimes external pressures on the client system make it change its behavior. For example, it is an environmental requiredness and societal expectation that an individual change his behavior. He becomes more mature as he grows older. Finally, there is the possibility that some internal requirements will lead to pressures towards change. For instance, a person may remove his psychological blocks which have prevented him from deriving happiness and satisfaction. Once done, this will automatically lead to a more satisfactory state of affairs. The second set of forces are the emergent forces towards change. As the change proceeds, additional constellation of change forces are required till final change objective has been achieved. These additional change forces, also known as emergent forces, and they steer the dynamic system towards change. There are several kinds of emergent forces. First, there is need to complete a task which has been begun. For example, if community undertakes a self-survey, the people involved feel some obligations to act upon the results which it produces. Similarly, people or organization that sponsor a workshop will look for ways to show that it has some positive effect. Second one, according to Kurt Lewin, at the beginning of change process, individual or group may show strong resistance to starting change activities. But once this point has passed and system has invested in the process, there are dramatic reversal and forces preventing change come to its support and steer it to completion of the change process. Third is expectations regarding the results of the change process, and this also acts as an emergent change force that arises in the change process between the client system and the change agent. As they work together, each develops expectations regarding the results of change process. The client system learns that change agent expects certain results from the change process, and these expectations constitute a force for change. Thus, if change process reaches the stage where client system is unable to take decisions, the change agent may insist and give a small shove to get the client system over the hump. Finally, sometimes the qualitative changes in part of the client system due to change process become emergent force for further adaptative changes throughout the system. For example, as therapy proceeds, there is an increase in ego strength of the individual. So, he becomes increasingly able to handle psychological problems which have been giving him difficulty. Similarly, parallel change forces work in multi-person client system like in individuals. Once the system works on small and immediate problems first, it gradually develops capacity for dealing with larger problems, and then change is initiated. Now, the third one is interdependence of subparts of a system as a source of change and resistance forces. The interdependence among subparts of a system can generate an emergent force towards change, and it can also serve as a source of resistance too. Similarly, if a change sequence has no effect on the system, consequently, it may fail to have any effect on any parts of the system. What is important here is size of the unit should be appropriate for change. If the subpart selected for change is too small, it will be unable to change because of resistance originating outside the subpart. Similarly, if the unit is too large but includes autonomous subsystems or subparts which are not directly involved in the change process, then too it may be unable to change because of the resistance originating from these subparts. On the other hand, if the size of the unit selected as a client system is appropriate for the particular change objective, and if several subparts of this system become committed to achieve the same objective, the motivation and energy available to the client system for working on change will be intensified by the interdependence and interaction among the subparts, and the system will undergo change. Next, certain mechanisms that operate to produce either change force or resistance force in the system are being discussed. The first one is expectations. In system consisting of more than one individual, the expectation held by one person or group about the behavior of other person or group serves as an important deter or motivator of behavior. People do what others expect them to do. As an example of how behavioral expectations can prevent change from occurring can be illustrated by a hypothetical case of a human relations training program in industry. Suppose that foremen are taken off their duties and given training in new ways of behaving towards their men. They are then returned to their original positions and responsibilities. The men working under the foremen in the meantime have not received any training and have retained their old behavior patterns and their old expectations about how the foremen will behave with them. Under these conditions, foremen are likely to resume their old patterns of supervision almost immediately. Some foremen who try the new techniques but do not get the desired result, as these are interpreted by men in light of old and inappropriate expectations, then these foremen too will return to their old patterns of supervision. In short, it is quite likely that workers would be so sure what to expect from their foremen that they would be unable to perceive or understand or even accept any significant changes in supervisory behavior. However, if both foreman and his workers are given separate training, then they all will be able to initiate and maintain the new and more satisfactory behavior patterns. Next is simultaneous satisfaction of different needs. Each system is made up of several subparts. When in a process of change, each subpart has its own needs, impulses and purpose. But unitary nature of the system makes separate and independent satisfaction or action by these subparts impossible. So, in the final outcome of change process, the system acts in a way that there is a general satisfaction derived to all of its subparts and not exclusively or fully satisfaction to any one subpart. At individual level, it is called as substitute gratification. For example, an individual who enjoys oral stimulation may take up cigarette smoking. The interdependence of subparts in a system can contribute to the promotion or obstruction of change. If the needs of the subparts are ignored, they would oppose the change and insist on preservation of the status quo. While on the other hand, if the change proposed meets some of the needs of the subparts and gives satisfaction to subparts, forces towards change would be generated in the system. Next is vulnerability to threat. When one system or subsystem is dependent on another, it wants to see the other maintain both its good health and its goodwill. This interdependence also makes the subparts vulnerable to threat. If the failure of any subpart of a system can cause failure for the whole system as a whole, then anything which threatens a part threatens the whole. It is not pleasant to feel threatened, and that pain can become a force towards change. Thus, pain originating in one part of a system may become sufficiently important for the whole system to undertake the necessary corrective action, in this case change, even if this is difficult. Some examples are an industrial organization offering employee benefits over and beyond those demanded by the union, or an individual entering psychotherapy knows that it is the only way to get rid of his severe headaches, or businessman who spends long hours commuting so that wife may live in a neighborhood she likes. We go to the fourth point, that is promise of benefits to one subpart of the client system at the expense of other parts is another reason of resistance towards change process by subparts. If one part tries to change, then the other part or parts may immediately conclude that this part or group must be trying to gain some special advantage. The defensive reaction naturally is to oppose the change without even considering its actual advantages or disadvantages. Change agents working with large organizations are well acquainted with these phenomena and hence use multiple entry procedure, which ensures that the change proposal is associated not exclusively with one part of the system, but with all the subparts. Whatever the terminology, the point is that interdependence among parts of a system is often associated with a fear that the improvement of one part can be gained only at the expense of another part. This has a tendency to lead to feeling threatened by any proposal for change except one's own. We now examine the fourth force for change, and this is the resistance force. It is not only the subparts of the system that face resistance, but it is the system as a whole that faces many resistance forces. Resistance to change process may emerge either at the beginning of the change process or during the process or even later on. Some types of resistance typically occur early in the process and others which are more likely to occur later on. Some resistance forces can crop at any time that it is not possible to group them into separate sections. Resistance forces are most active and increase in intensity for a while at the beginning of change project. At this stage, the conflict between the change forces and the resistance forces stalls the process of change till conflict resolution between change forces and resistance forces is not done. The deadlock may be broken either by working through or weakening the resistance force and strengthening the change forces. The most common resistance at the beginning of change process is general opposition to any kind of change. This often grows out of combination with fear of ignorance of the client system, that it will be unable to change successfully, or the fear that once accomplished the change will require things of people which they are unable to deliver. Hence, maintaining status quo is the best and the safest rather than facing threat of failure. Sometimes these feelings of inadequacy are quite justified as they emanate from client system's lack of skill, experience or capacity for action that is necessary to carry them through change. Sometimes resistance is against proposed change objective and not against the change process. Sometimes the change objective appears to be of doubtful value and the question is whether or not it is safe to experiment. Another reason for resistance to change is clinging to existing satisfaction at the unchanged state. The subparts along with vested interest groups are happy not to change because they know the benefit from the status quo and want to keep it that way. For example, we carry on with our traditions and customs and old ways of social life over generations since we are reluctant to give up the pleasure, satisfaction and security these ways give us since they have always been followed that way. Sometimes resistance in the relationship between the client system and the change agent is observed at the beginning of the change process. In the beginning of the change process, there may be mistrust due to unfamiliarity with the change agent. That is, the change agent may appear to be too alien or even too friendly. Moreover, unfamiliarity with the help extended by the change agent may raise suspicion in the client system. Sometimes change agent may not be acceptable to the client system. Later on in the change process, dissatisfaction with change agent may occur due to disappointment with what change agent has to offer in the change process. Emergent forces may even resist change that were unnoticed and unimportant at the beginning of change process and subsequently turn into major obstacles in change process. For example, client system may be related to the system in its environment which are opposed to change. At the beginning of the change process, these oppositions may not have been observed or may have been ignored, but later on they cause serious obstacles. Even the cost of change project in terms of time, money, energy may be beyond the client system to handle and eventually the client system becomes unwilling to continue further with the change process. The impeding end of the relationship with the change agent may lead to either change or resistance forces. With imminent loss of help and support from the change agent, the client system may decide that it must hurry up and get something done, or that since there is no time to finish anything anyway, or it would be better not to start anything. Now, many resistance forces can be converted into change forces. If the client insists on maintaining the status quo as needs can be met satisfactorily, the change agent may be able to show that same needs would be met even more satisfactorily in a changed set of conditions. Some change agent welcome resistance because it gives information about the important motivation and difficulties of the client system. Thus, change process and therapy is sometimes said to consist of working through series of resistance. Next, we will examine interference. Interference is a type of force which is not specifically opposed to change objective, but which nevertheless diverts the energies of the client system away from the change objective. For example, a proposal to build a new city hall may be defeated not because of opposition to such a building, but because it seemed that a new school building has even more urgent need. So, interference may arise when other projects compete with the change project for time, energy and money of the client system, or when there is lack of ideas or too many ideas, or lack of skill and even lack of information or presence of conflicting information about how to execute the change project, or when the environment is simply intractable. Next, we will examine goals and value dilemmas in the planning of change. Planning is sought to convert change that leads to improvement. But which changes are improvements? While seeking answer to this question, man has to agree upon some normative standards and value criteria by which changes can be judged as good or bad, desirable or undesirable. There are no ready-made agreements or norms to tell whether changes are improvements. Hence, the process of engineering can provide valid and acceptable agreement on what changes are improvements, and they must become more self-conscious and self-critical than in the past. Since societies are no longer homogeneous and uniform, but an amalgamation of many cultures, many religions, different social classes, hence those who plan change should look for valid direction or change in the presence of discrepant and conflicting goal orientations. Further, more fundamentally, by what methods can men already in conflict about value judge the validity of values in such conflicts? Mannheim, in his book Roots of the Crisis in Evaluation, delves into the social roots of the deep cutting disruption of the consensus in the value orientation of the contemporary men. It becomes essential that while examining values in the process of change, they must be analyzed from both descriptive and normative point of view. Since science is an integral part in planning of change, hence methods of science must be carefully analyzed and assessed. If any clarity concerning direction of good change is to be attained. In the West, there is a wide view of tenability of liberal democratic heritage. Under this heritage, values related to rationality are the most basic to man's ability to plan for future. The scientific achievements of man support man's growing ability to select from alternatives. However, the new orthodox theologians today seek to lure liberal man back to reliance upon some favored faith, political realists, conservatives or radical seeking to short circuit the efficiency and slowness of democratic rationality in accomplishing the ends through some alleged unnecessary absolutism. Another cluster of values in the liberal democratic heritage, which are said to be doomed by planned change, are of freedom and individuality. There is empirical justification in the recent history, which shows fascist and Nazi planning explicitly sought to constrict and destroy these values. Soviet planning radically subordinates them to other values. Given the planning efforts in United States have not always placed freedom and individuality as compared to productivity, health, orderliness or efficiency high in hierarchy of values to be enhanced through planning. Hence, there is genuine problem between planning and freedom, and it becomes difficult to maintain value of freedom high in hierarchy of values of those responsible for planning. In conclusion, change is inevitable. Every social thinker, to whichever school of thought he or she may belong, concurs to this thought. Every process of change is subjected to two forces, which increase or decrease the readiness of client system to change. They are change forces, which are called the driving forces, which increase the willingness of the client to change and promote change. Then there are the resistance forces, which oppose change and reduce the willingness of system to change. This module delved into all the change forces which might motivate a client system to make changes. While planning for change, the goal and value dilemmas in planning of change are very important, and the change agents have to decide on value orientations while planning for change.